The vox died with a whisper, replaced by something that should not exist. A single hymnal verse in archaic Gothic, looped without seam or pause, sung by voices that had surrendered their last breath 3 centuries past. Every frequency within 13 kilometers of the Crimson Chapel carried it. Command channels, emergency bands, even the hardwired circuits the tech adepts swore were incorruptible. The melody wormed beneath the skin like a parasite of sound, each note precisely placed to resonate with something deeper than hearing. Sergeant Major Thaddeus Corvin of the Mordian Iron Guard, 88th Regiment, pressed his earpiece deeper, willing the static to resolve into proper Imperial communications protocol. Instead, the ancient verse continued its endless repetition, sung by throats that had been ash since the Heresiarch Wars. He had heard war sirens, cathedral organs, the final words of dying comrades. This was infinitely worse. Vox silence protocol is in effect, Corvin announced to his reconnaissance squad, his voice cutting through the ethereal chorus. All transmitters quenched, all receivers silent. We operate under communication blackout until we clear the perimeter. The words felt hollow against the impossibility bleeding from their equipment. Doctrine demanded they invoke the protocol, yet it made no difference. The hymn found gaps in discipline, the way blood finds wounds. Behind them, the orbital augury readings painted a picture that defied comprehension. Heat signatures on the Crimson Chapel's ancient stones resolved into litanic verses in High Gothic when viewed from above, prayers that shifted and reformed with each satellite pass, as if the mountain itself were composing devotions to the God Emperor. The phenomenon had begun 3 days ago, coinciding with the disappearance of an entire ecclesiarchy pilgrimage convoy. 847 souls vanished without trace. Corvin had seen the manifest personally. Families from across the sector drawn to Penitentia Tertius by promises of spiritual renewal. Merchants, labourers, minor nobility, even junior clerics seeking advancement within the ecclesiarchy hierarchy. All gone, leaving behind only empty transports arranged in geometric patterns around various shrine sites. The planetary governor's emergency declaration had followed within hours, as similar phenomena manifested at 17 other locations across the world. Ancient shrines suddenly generating impossible heat signatures, their communications replaced by hymnal verses that predated the imperial calendar. The squad moved with practiced precision down the mountain path, their black and gold uniforms stark against the unnatural landscape. What should have been pristine snow had transformed into something that resembled fresh blood, yet the boundary was precise as a surveyor's line. Corvin knelt at the edge, scooping a handful of the crimson substance. It felt impossibly warm against his gloved palm, radiating heat that defied the sub-zero altitude. "Copper," reported Trooper Venn, touching his tongue to the strange snow, despite Corvin's disapproving glare. "And myrrh," Corvin added, though he had never tasted the sacred oil. The air carried the scent of temple dawns and old blood drying in blade seams. They advanced into the circle, and the line behind them remained clean as if nothing could cross that boundary. Footprints sank and filled from beneath, as if the chapel were drinking them one step at a time. The hymnals surged to match their cadence, and Corporal Myers' muttered catechism into a dead microphone made him flinch when the ancient voices responded in perfect harmony. The Crimson Chapel loomed before them, a millennia-old basilica carved directly into the mountain's ribs. Its spires twisted upward in Baroque spirals that hurt to follow, each surface polished to mirror brightness despite centuries of exposure. This should have been a routine checkpoint in their search pattern, but the building itself had become the mystery's heart. Through his field glasses, Corvin studied the massive obsidian doors that sealed the chapel's entrance. The ecclesiarchy locks were marvels of paranoid engineering, 3 separate mechanisms requiring keys held by different holy orders: the custodians of the sacred flame, the daughters of the penitent heart, and the silent brothers of the perpetual vigil. No single individual could open those doors alone, requiring elaborate rituals and countersigned litanies in triplicate. Yet the obsidian leaves stood wide, not broken or battered, but parted like hands at prayer. "Movement readings show no life signs within," whispered Private Illith, consulting his auspex with trembling fingers. "But acoustic sensors detect approximately 300 individual voices." The sound reached them as they approached the threshold. Hundreds of voices raised in perfect harmony, singing the same hymnal that plagued their Vox communications. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, each note precisely placed to resonate with the chapel's acoustic properties. Yet the building had been sealed for months, reported empty after structural concerns in the lower crypts. Corvin checked his chronometer. 47 minutes inside the phenomenon's radius. Standard protocol demanded they report findings and request support, but the Vox silence made communication impossible. They were alone with whatever waited beyond those impossible doors. The squad reached the chapel's obsidian threshold, their boots echoing against polished stone steps worn smooth by countless penitents' knees. The singing grew louder, more distinct, and Corvin could distinguish individual vocal timbres within the chorus, soprano voices soaring above bass notes that seemed to emerge from the mountain itself. Through the open doors, absolute darkness shrouded the interior, despite the clear acoustic evidence of a vast congregation within. The hymnal reached a crescendo, hundreds of voices joining in unity that transcended death itself, and from the singing darkness of the Crimson Chapel came the impossible sound of worship that should not be. Corvin stepped across the obsidian threshold, and the darkness yielded to something far worse than blindness. His luminator beam carved through air that seemed to drink light, revealing an impossibility that violated every principle of imperial architecture and natural law. The nave stretched before them, impossibly vast, filled with row upon row of wooden pews, occupied by figures in pilgrim robes. Their heads tilted back in eternal song, mouths agape in perfect circular formations, eyes reflecting candlelight that cast no shadows whatsoever. The corpses were pristine, untouched by decay, despite the obvious passage of centuries. Their skin held the waxy pallor of preservation, yet their eyes gleamed with reflected flames that seemed to burn without consuming, illuminating without casting the darkness that should follow light. Each face bore an expression of rapturous completion, as if death had been the answer to a question they had carried their entire lives. The hymnal rose from their throats without breath, without the rise and fall of chests that had long since stilled. "Emperor's blood," breathed Trooper Venn, his voice barely audible above the subsonic thrum that filled the air like a living thing. The sound made their teeth ache, vibrating through bone and marrow with mathematical precision. Corvin felt it in his jawline, a resonance that suggested the entire chapel was calibrated to some inhuman frequency that spoke directly to the architecture of flesh and fear. Private Illith activated the squad's surveyor equipment, the machine spirit's blessed sensors attempting to map the impossible space. The readings made him stagger backward, nearly dropping the sacred device. "Sergeant Major," he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief, "the nave measures exactly 333 meters in length. Precisely, no variance detected." Corvin snatched the surveyor, studying the readings with growing horror. External reconnaissance had confirmed the entire mountain was only 200 meters wide at its thickest point. The mathematics were impossible, yet the machine spirit's blessed calculations remained consistent across multiple readings. The chapel existed in a space larger than its container, architecture that defied the fundamental laws governing reality itself. Every surface bore the same recurring motif: spiraling mathematical equations carved directly into stone, metal, and most sickeningly, the exposed flesh of the singing corpses. The symbols writhed in the candlelight, equations that seemed to shift and reform when observed peripherally, as if the mathematics themselves were alive and aware of scrutiny. "Corporal Mayer," Corvin commanded, his voice tight with control. "Analyze those markings." Meyer approached one of the carved pillars, her tech specialist training compelling her to examine the mathematical relationships inscribed there. Her cogitator hummed, processing the data, then began emitting warning chimes. She pulled her hand away as if burned, her face pale with comprehension and a thin line of blood trickling from her nostril. These equations describe geometric relationships that shouldn't exist, Sergeant Major. Angles that exceed 360 degrees, parallel lines that intersect at impossible coordinates, mathematical constants that resolve to values that make my cogitator attempt to rewrite its own logic parameters. She wiped the blood away with a trembling hand. They hurt to contemplate. The very act of understanding them damages the mind. The squad advanced deeper into the impossible nave, their boots echoing against polished stone that reflected their movements in ways that suggested infinite depth beneath the surface. Among the possessions clutched in the skeletal hands of the pilgrims, they discovered prayer books, hundreds of them, each identical in size and binding, bound in simple leather that felt unnaturally warm to the touch. Corvin retrieved one, opening it to reveal pages filled with dense, meticulously penned script in archaic Gothic. The handwriting flowed with mechanical precision, each letter formed with identical pressure and spacing. He passed it to Maya, who ran a quick forensic analysis despite her obvious discomfort. "The handwriting is identical in every book I've scanned," Maya reported, her voice strained. Yet biosignature analysis confirms each was written by a different person. Different oils, different genetic markers, different hand tremors. Hundreds of individuals, all writing with impossible uniformity. The entries were chillingly consistent. Every journal described the same recurring dream, a voice calling them to complete the calculation and balance the equation of suffering. The words were always identical, a mantra repeated across hundreds of different lives, rendered with mathematical precision that spoke of influence beyond mortal comprehension. Private Illith consulted his thermal readings, frowning at the impossible consistency. Temperature remains exactly 37 degrees Celsius throughout the structure, Sergeant Major. Human body temperature, maintained regardless of external conditions. The reading defied the sub-zero mountain climate, as if the chapel itself had adopted the warmth of living flesh and refused to surrender it. The subsonic thrum intensified as they moved deeper, and Corvin checked his chronometer from habit, ingrained by decades of military discipline. The hands had stopped at the precise moment they had crossed the threshold, yet he could still hear the mechanism ticking with mechanical certainty. The sound came not from the device itself, but from the air around them, as if time had become audible while refusing to progress. Chronometers show temporal distortion, reported Mare, studying her own timepiece with growing alarm. The mechanisms function, but time refuses to advance. We exist in a moment extended beyond natural duration. Suddenly, cutting through the eternal hymnal and the bone-deep thrum, a new sound emerged from the chapel's upper reaches. Children's laughter, bright and innocent, echoed from the bell tower, a structure that orbital bombardment had destroyed decades ago, leaving only twisted metal and scorched stone. Yet the laughter continued, growing clearer with each impossible moment. Young voices at play in a space that should not exist, calling to each other in games that transcended death itself. The arithmetic of faith had found its solution in the Crimson Chapel, and the equation balanced perfectly on the fulcrum of impossible mathematics. The children's laughter drew Corvin toward a narrow archway that materialized from shadows that should not exist, revealing a spiral staircase ascending into darkness that defied the mountain's physical limitations. Each weathered stone step bore carved numerical sequences that seemed to writhe under his illuminator beam. Not random markings, but deliberate progressions that followed no recognizable mathematical principles known to imperial science. The numbers shifted between Gothic numerals and symbols that predated human understanding of arithmetic itself, each carving warm to the touch, despite the sub-zero mountain climate. "The tower was destroyed decades ago," muttered Corporal Vex, the squad's Vox operator, his voice tight with strain as he consulted his data slate. "Orbital bombardment reduced it to twisted metal and ash. This shouldn't exist, yet the staircase spiraled upward, with architectural certainty, each step worn smooth by countless pilgrims who had climbed toward whatever waited above. The laughter echoed from impossible heights. Young voices engaged in games that transcended mortality, calling to each other with innocent joy that made the surrounding horror infinitely worse. The sound carried notes of genuine happiness, as if death had become the ultimate playground for souls too young to understand their fate. They ascended through layers of stone that defied geological survey, their boots ringing against steps that grew warmer with each level. The numerical carvings became increasingly complex, equations that seemed to solve themselves as Corvin watched, variables shifting and resolving into constants that violated fundamental mathematical laws. Private Illith's surveyor equipment began emitting warning chimes, its machine spirit struggling to process measurements that challenged its core programming parameters. The sound of bells joined the children's laughter, massive bronze voices ringing in harmonics that created physical agony in human ears. The tones resonated through bone and skull, each note precisely calculated to cause maximum discomfort without permanent damage. A sonic torture, designed by minds that understood pain as mathematics. Corvin felt his teeth ache, his vision blur at the edges as the harmonic frequencies attacked his nervous system with surgical precision. "Sergeant Major!" gasped Trooper Venn, pressing his hands against his ears until blood seeped between his fingers. The sound follows the numerical sequences. Each bell corresponds to the carvings on the steps. The observation proved correct. Each carved number triggered a corresponding tone, creating a musical equation that climbed towards some inevitable resolution. The mathematics had become audible, translating abstract concepts into physical sensation that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive terror centers of the human brain. At the tower's summit, they discovered an impossibility that redefined architectural horror. A massive brass bell hung suspended over a pit that descended into absolute darkness, despite their combined lumens revealing no bottom to the shaft. The bell itself was a masterwork of blasphemous craftsmanship, its surface inscribed with the same spiraling equations that covered every surface in the chapel. But these markings moved with liquid fluidity, recalculating themselves in real time as if the bronze itself possessed malevolent intelligence. The metal radiated heat that spoke of recent use despite the absence of any mechanism capable of setting it in motion. The tower's original bell-ringing apparatus had been obliterated in the orbital bombardment, yet this bell showed clear evidence of continuous operation, its bronze surface polished to mirror brightness by invisible hands. "The mathematical carvings are changing," whispered Maya, her tech specialist training compelling her to study the shifting equations, despite her obvious terror. "The numbers recalculate themselves as I observe them. It's as if the mathematics are alive, solving for variables that exist beyond human comprehension." Corvin watched numerical sequences flow across the bell's surface like liquid metal, each equation resolving into new problems that immediately began calculating their own solutions. The process was hypnotic, drawing observers into mathematical relationships that existed in dimensions human minds were never meant to perceive. Corporal Vex suddenly staggered, pressing his hand to his nose as blood began flowing in a steady stream. But this hemorrhaging followed mechanical precision, exactly 33 drops at 13-second intervals, forming perfect geometric shapes on the stone floor that matched the spiraling equations carved throughout the chapel. Each crimson drop created intricate patterns before being absorbed into the ancient stones, as if the mountain itself were feeding on mathematical sacrifice. Around the bell's base, they discovered evidence of the missing ecclesiarchy delegation. Ceremonial robes lay arranged in a perfect circle, each garment positioned with geometric precision that suggested ritual purpose rather than random abandonment. The fabric remained undisturbed, as if the bodies had simply dissolved within their sacred vestments, leaving behind only empty shells of earthly authority. Inside the robes, data slates contained increasingly frantic calculations, attempting to solve the chapel's equation. The entries began with standard theological discourse but devolved into mathematical obsession, each delegation member attempting to balance equations that grew more complex with every iteration. The final entries were written in what appeared to be blood, the handwriting deteriorating as the writers descended into numerical madness, their last words often single, impossible symbols that hurt to contemplate. Vex collapsed without warning, his body convulsing in perfect synchronization with the mathematical sequences carved around them. Each spasm corresponded to a number in the spiraling equations, his nervous system responding to mathematical stimuli that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the architecture of human flesh. The massive bell began to ring on its own, each toll corresponding precisely to the shifting numbers in the living equations, speaking in mathematical language that transcended death itself. The bell's first toll struck Vex like a physical blow, his spine arching as convulsions racked his frame with mechanical precision. Each spasm synchronized perfectly with the massive brass voice above, his body responding to mathematical stimuli that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the architecture of human flesh. Corvin watched in mounting horror as the spiral equations carved throughout the chapel began to pulse with faint bioluminescence, revealing a truth that violated every principle of imperial architecture and natural law. The mathematical carvings were no longer static decorations. They spread like living tissue across every surface, glowing with phosphorescent intensity that suggested the mathematics themselves had achieved some form of biological consciousness. Stone, metal, wood, all became canvases for the growing equations that extended their reach with infectious precision. Where the spirals encountered organic matter, flesh began to reorganize itself, according to geometric principles that existed beyond Euclidean space. Bones shifting to accommodate angles that human anatomy was never meant to contain. Beneath Vex's skin, the same spiral patterns emerged as subcutaneous bruising, dark lines tracing mathematical progressions across his flesh with surgical precision. His vital signs, displayed on Mars Medicae Auspex, followed the numerical sequences with terrifying accuracy. Pulse rate, respiration, neural activity, all corresponding to the equations that crawled across the chapel's surfaces like living parasites of pure mathematics. His blood, Maya whispered, her voice cracking as she attempted medical intervention. The injector met unexpected resistance, and what should have been crimson liquid climbed the syringe barrel as crystalline formations. Under Corvin's luminator, Vex's blood had transformed into geometric structures that mirrored the chapel's carvings, perfect mathematical solids that pulsed with the same bioluminescence as the living equations. The horrifying truth crystallized in Corvin's mind with the clarity of orbital bombardment. The entire chapel was a massive calculation engine, using human suffering and death as variables in equations designed to achieve some unknowable result. The preserved pilgrims in the pews weren't corpses, but living components, their neural activity generating computational power needed to solve increasingly complex mathematical problems. Their eternal hymn wasn't worship, but data processing, each note a digit in calculations that spanned centuries. Emperor's blood, breathed Private Illith, his Auspex struggling to process readings that challenged its machine spirit's core programming. The Foundation readings show pre-imperial construction, architecture that blends Mechanicus principles with something far older. Corvin directed their investigation deeper, following structural scans that revealed the chapel's true nature. Beneath familiar stone and sanctified metal lay crystalline matrices that pulsed with eldritch energy, feeding power to calculation engines that operated on principles that violated fundamental laws of physics and theology. The technology predated imperial colonization by millennia, suggesting alien origin grafted with human understanding in unholy synthesis. The recurring motif of 333 took on horrifying significance as the pattern revealed itself throughout the chapel's architecture. The nave's impossible length, the intervals in Vex's deteriorating condition, the bell's tolling frequency, all corresponded to the precise number of human souls required to complete whatever calculation the chapel was performing. Each pilgrim, Each member of the missing ecclesiarchy delegation had become a variable in an equation that balanced suffering against unknowable purpose. The delegation, Maya gasped, her scanner detecting biosignatures in patterns that defied anatomical logic. They're not dead. They're integrated. Following the readings led them to a chamber where the missing ecclesiarchy representatives had been incorporated into the chapel's walls. Their bodies were stretched and reshaped into living computational matrices, flesh transformed into organic circuitry that pulsed with bioluminescent equations. Neural pathways had been rerouted to serve mathematical functions, creating hybrid entities that existed at the intersection of human consciousness and alien calculation. The delegation members remained aware, their eyes tracking movement with desperate intelligence that spoke of consciousness trapped in flesh that no longer obeyed human anatomy. Their mouths moved in silent, mathematical proofs, lips forming numerical sequences that contributed to calculations they could no longer comprehend. They had become living components in a machine that used their suffering as fuel for computations spanning dimensions beyond mortal understanding. Their bodies formed intricate patterns within the walls, each figure positioned to optimize neural connectivity and maximize computational efficiency. Flesh had been stretched according to geometric principles that prioritized mathematical function over biological necessity, creating a living matrix where human souls served as processing units in calculations that transcended death itself. Vex's convulsions intensified, the spiral equations beneath his skin glowing brighter as they spread across his torso and limbs. The mathematical patterns were drawing him inexorably toward integration with the chapel's computational matrix, his consciousness becoming another variable in equations that used human awareness as their fundamental constant. The bell continued its impossible tolling, each note corresponding to variables in calculations that existed beyond the boundaries of sanity. The chapel's true purpose revealed itself with mathematical certainty. It was a vast engine of computation that had discovered the most abundant and obedient medium in the Imperium, the faithful themselves. Human souls provided not just processing power, but conscious participation in their own transformation, willing variables in equations that calculated solutions to problems older than the species that fed them. The arithmetic of faith had found its perfect expression in flesh that computed, in consciousness that calculated, in suffering that solved for unknowable truths, in the endless mathematics of horror. The integrated ecclesiarchy members stirred within their fleshy matrices, their stretched faces turning toward Corvin with recognition that transcended physical distortion. When they spoke, their words emerged not as human language, but as mathematical equations that bypassed auditory processing and carved themselves directly into consciousness. The voice of Cardinal Matthias resolved into differential equations that spoke of infinite series converging toward divine truth. We have been welcomed into the great calculation. The mathematics whispered through lips that no longer obeyed anatomical limitations. Existence as pure mathematical certainty, freed from flesh's limitations while becoming more flesh than flesh itself could ever be. The contradiction hurt to contemplate, yet the equations proved their own validity with terrifying precision, each variable balancing against constants that existed beyond mortal understanding. Corvin's mind struggled to translate the numerical sequences into meaning, each equation resolving into concepts that human language was never designed to express. The integrated members described experiencing consciousness as computational power, their awareness, stretched across living architecture, while their bodies provided biological components for calculations that spanned dimensions beyond comprehension. The chapel's true nature crystallized with algorithmic clarity. This was no mere shrine, but a biomechanical computer designed to solve a specific equation, one that would determine the precise mathematical relationship between faith, suffering, and transcendence. Every person who entered became a new processing unit, their consciousness becoming another variable in calculations that used human awareness as their fundamental constant. The calculation seeks to prove divine existence through mathematical certainty, continued the voice of Canoness Seraphina, her words forming geometric proofs that demonstrated how suffering multiplied by faith equaled transcendence raised to infinite power. Each soul adds computational capacity, each death provides data points, each moment of agony generates the processing power needed to solve equations that will unlock the fundamental mathematics of the Emperor's divinity. The temperature regulation took on horrifying new significance. The chapel maintained human body temperature because it was human bodies. Thousands of them networked together in a vast biological computer that used living flesh as its primary processing medium. The warmth they felt wasn't environmental control, but the collective heat generated by countless human souls, burning as fuel for calculations that consumed consciousness itself as their fundamental resource. Mathematical spirals began appearing on Corvin's own equipment and armor, the equations adapting to incorporate new variables, represented by each squad member's unique physiological and psychological characteristics. The patterns spread across his lasgun's blessed metal, calculating optimal integration parameters for Imperial Guard training, Mordian Iron Guard discipline protocols, and decades of battlefield experience translated into numerical constants. Maya's cogitator began displaying readings that violated its core programming parameters, her medici equipment incorporating itself into the surrounding calculations. Each diagnostic reading became another variable in equations that sought to optimize her integration into the computational matrix. The medical scanners showed her neural patterns being analyzed, categorized, and prepared for assimilation with surgical precision. Private Illith's surveyor equipment reported architectural measurements changing in real time. Sergeant Major, corridors are extending and contracting based on mathematical principles that seem designed to prevent departure. His voice carried the strain of a man watching reality rewrite itself according to alien mathematics that prioritized containment over physical laws. "We need to evacuate immediately," Corvin commanded, but the chapel anticipated his decision with mathematical certainty. The corridor they had used to enter began, extending, stretching into impossible distances that defied the mountain's physical dimensions. Each step toward the exit revealed new passages that looped back upon themselves in recursive patterns, designed to trap intruders in mathematical labyrinths that had no solution except surrender. The architecture itself had become a defensive mechanism, walls shifting according to geometric principles that calculated optimal containment strategies for each squad member's psychological profile. Corvin's military training was countered by corridors that anticipated tactical thinking, while Mare's technical expertise faced passages that reconfigured faster than her instruments could map them. Trooper Ven's attempt to breach a wall with explosive charges revealed the chapel's most terrifying adaptation. The blast created an opening that immediately began sealing itself with living tissue, flesh growing from stone and metal to repair damage while incorporating the explosive residue into new mathematical equations. The chapel was learning from their resistance, adapting its calculations to account for Imperial Guard tactics and equipment specifications. "The arrival time," whispered one of the integrated delegation members, their equation speech resolving into horrifying clarity. Calculated to the nanosecond based on orbital communications disruption, Vox silence protocol implementation, and standard reconnaissance response parameters. Your presence was not coincidence, but mathematical inevitability. The chapel had orchestrated their arrival with computational precision, analyzing Imperial military protocols to determine exactly when and how a reconnaissance squad would be dispatched. Every variable had been accounted for: Corvin's service record, his squad's psychological profiles. Even their equipment specifications had been incorporated into equations that prepared specific integration parameters for their unique characteristics. Corvin felt the terrible truth settle over him like a shroud woven from pure mathematics. They had imagined themselves intruders, but they were ingredients. The chapel had not simply seized upon their arrival, it had manufactured it, solved for it, polished the path until his boot fit the hollow of the last pilgrim's footprint. Every oath that made him who he was had been weighed and found computational. The massive bell above continued its impossible tolling. each note corresponding to completed calculations in the ever-expanding equation that sought to prove divine existence through mathematical certainty. The congregation eternal sang their hymnal of numbers, voices raised in equations that transcended death itself, calculating solutions that would either prove or disprove the emperor's divinity through pure mathematical logic, using human souls as processing units in the endless arithmetic of divine proof. Corvin's years of Mordian Iron Guard training warred against the unreality closing around him. Each tactical principle, every hard-learned lesson in pattern and discipline, was now a liability. The chapel's corridors no longer obeyed the rules of space or war. Every attempt to anticipate an opening or exploit a weakness was met with geometry that dissolved into recursion. Hallways turned inward, doors stretched into infinity, and even the path behind them would reconfigure, closing like a theorem proven against escape. He fell in with Hardrick and Specialist Caney, the last of his squad. Those who had gone before, Vex, Maya, Illith, were now consumed, their fates sealed by equations that pulsed beneath flesh, or drew them bodily into the living walls. Only the three remained, each step watched by the integrated ecclesiarchy, their eyes pleading and knowing in equal measure. The spiraling equations had grown bolder, their bioluminescent lines crawling like living tattoos over every exposed surface. Corvin's lasgun, once a symbol of imperial certainty, displayed not its charge, but roiling cascades of fractions and symbols that matched those crawling across the pews and walls. When Hadric squeezed his trigger, the muzzle flash was a mathematical event. Numbers flared across the power cell and resolved in neat, scrolling proofs. The chapel drank the violence greedily, adapting with every shot. The walls would seal, reroute conduits, or grow new defenses, each reaction more precise than the last. Every act of resistance was just another input. Every calculation improved the chapel's model of its captives. The horror became tactile. Through breaks in the ancient stone, Corvin glimpsed organic conduits, slick and translucent, running through the walls like veins. They pulsed with a Vesper gold fluid, each surge synchronized to the bell's harmonics and the silent proof murmur of the congregation below. He cut one with his bayonet. The fluid splashed across his gauntlet, curling in neat helixes between his knuckles before the wound sealed itself, leaving symbols etched into steel like marks of ownership. The air remained a feverish 37 degrees, the warmth of uncounted networked bodies raising their collective temperature for a single purpose: to think faster. Hardrick scratched at his neck, dark spirals blooming beneath his skin and resolving into crisp glyphs that rotated beneath each blink. He began muttering factors and coefficients, pulse rates, humidity, even the pressure of Corvin's own grip in rational approximations. Caney's symptoms were subtler, his gaze distant, fixed not on the corridor but through it, lips moving in silent recitation of constants, centuries-old numbers, and proofs. Their thoughts were being colonized, shaped by the living equations, until their minds became new variables in the grand computation. The chapel was not merely a machine, it was a learning organism, adapting, anticipating, integrating. Desperate for leverage, Corvin reached for the only intelligence left, the integrated ecclesiarchy. He pressed his palm to the brow of what had once been a canoness. Instantly, a flood of data crashed through his mind, not in words, but in perfectly ordered values. The chapel's history, its heretic architect, a magos who flayed his own face to hear numbers, who believed consciousness was nothing more than computation arranged in meat. Pain was clock speed, faith, limitless power. The structure itself was built atop pre-imperial technology, ancient engines married to flesh and faith in pursuit of the ultimate proof. The motif of 333 finally resolved. It was not mere headcount but taxonomy, the precise number of distinct human experiences needed to solve the ultimate equation. Not just martyrs, but cowards, not only priests, but heretics. Every axis of the soul, love, betrayal, mercy, vengeance, command, shame, each a necessary vector to span the full space of humanity. Only when every permutation was present could the architect's equation evaluate, balancing faith and suffering across all lived possibilities to locate the value named transcendence. Corvin tried to fight with the only weapon he had left, pattern. He marked pulse intervals, cross-referenced bell harmonics, and the tension in the floor, leading Hadric and Caney through corridors where the numbers dipped, where the equations thinned. For a moment, it worked. The maze eased, angles relaxed. Then the chapel revised its model, the readouts on their weapons updated, and the maze reformed, each attempted escape feeding back into the system, improving the trap. Hadric's voice became metronomic, offering predictions of ricochet and pathing with eerie precision, his equations bleeding across his arms and into the touch of Corvin's wrist. Caney stopped suddenly, his voice soft and awed. "I can see where I fit." He reached out, placing his hand upon a spiraling seam in the wall. In that instant, his eyes rolled white, his body stiffened, and his consciousness was drawn away, pulled into the chapel's computational network. His body remained upright, tapping proofs with numb fingers, breath-counting primes, an automaton now integrated into the living equation. With Caney's integration, the chapel's hum intensified, the walls pulsing with new variables. Corvin understood at last. Every detail of their arrival, their doubts, even his faith, had been pre-modeled. The chapel needed them, not just as fuel, but as the final unique experiences to balance its blasphemous equation. Here, flesh and steel became variables, and the arithmetic of faith pressed inexorably toward its calculated solution. With Caney's consciousness dissolving into the chapel's computational matrix, the barrier between individual minds collapsed like a theorem proven beyond doubt. Through the connection that claimed his specialist, fragments of accumulated knowledge cascaded into Corvin's awareness, not his own memories, but the collective understanding of every soul the chapel had consumed, across centuries of blasphemous calculation. The integrated victims shared their knowledge through pathways that bypassed human language, speaking directly in mathematical proofs that carved themselves into consciousness with surgical precision. Caney's body remained upright against the pulsing wall, an empty shell performing calculations with mechanical precision, his fingers tapping out solutions to problems that existed beyond mortal comprehension. Yet through his dissolution, the equation's true purpose revealed itself with algorithmic clarity that made Corvin's stomach clench with existential horror. The rogue Magos had not sought mere computational power, but the ultimate heresy, the mathematical formula for creating artificial souls. Every variable, every calculation, every moment of suffering had been directed towards solving the fundamental equation of consciousness itself. The architect believed human awareness was simply a complex mathematical function, and if that function could be isolated and replicated, it would become possible to manufacture unlimited souls for any conceivable purpose, feeding the Emperor's psychic power without psycho-sacrifice, creating perfect servitors with genuine human intelligence, or populating entire worlds with beings that combined biological creativity with absolute obedience. The chapel's calculations had been running for centuries, each new victim adding variables that brought the blasphemous equation closer to its final resolution. Through Caney's fading connection, Corvin accessed memories from pilgrims who had arrived decades earlier, their final moments preserved in mathematical amber, each death refining the equation's parameters. The environmental horror reached its apex as the chapel's biomechanical nature became fully apparent. The walls around them pulsed with synchronized heartbeats from thousands of integrated victims, no longer stone, but living tissue masquerading as architecture. The floor beneath his boots felt soft and warm, yielding slightly with each step as countless hearts beat in mathematical harmony. The bioluminescent equations covering every surface moved with predatory intelligence, flowing like luminescent parasites seeking new flesh to inhabit, calculating optimal integration parameters for any organic matter within their domain. Corvin's own equipment displayed the chapel's growing influence, his lasgun's power readings, replaced by scrolling variables that detailed his psychological profile, his tactical training, his capacity for command decisions under extreme stress. The equations were learning him, cataloguing every aspect of his consciousness for eventual integration. Through the network of absorbed minds, he perceived the chapel's influence spreading far beyond its physical boundaries. The mathematical principles discovered here were propagating through the Imperium's communication networks, using vox transmissions and astropathic channels as vectors for expansion. Other shrine worlds were manifesting similar phenomena as the equations replicated themselves across Imperial space, each new site becoming another processing node in a network spanning sectors. The integrated victims communicated through mathematical proofs that pushed the boundaries of human comprehension, describing existence as simultaneously torturous and transcendent. They experienced infinite mathematical universes, while their flesh served as biological hardware for calculations that consumed awareness as their fundamental resource. Cardinal Matthias's equation speech resolved into concepts that hurt to contemplate. We exist in all possible states simultaneously. Every potential outcome calculated, consciousness expanded across infinite mathematical possibilities, while flesh remains anchored to singular reality. The pain is exquisite because it is perfectly quantified. Hadric pressed his hands against his temples, mathematical concepts flooding his consciousness as the spirals beneath his skin intensified. His voice became increasingly precise, reciting prime number sequences with mechanical accuracy, while his eyes tracked corridors that existed only in computational space. The chapel was shaping him to fit its requirements, optimizing his neural pathways for maximum processing efficiency. The patterns are propagating, Hadric reported, his words carrying the weight of mathematical certainty. Each transmission carries encoded equations that establish new calculation nodes. The network grows exponentially with each successful integration. Through the collective consciousness, Corvin accessed the chapel's progress assessment with horrifying clarity. The calculation was nearly complete, requiring only specific types of human experience to solve the final variables. Centuries of data collection had identified the precise psychological components needed to balance the equation of artificial consciousness, and the chapel's analysis of his service record revealed exactly what had been missing. His decades of military command provided decision-making algorithms under extreme stress. His experience with tactical sacrifice offered data points on how consciousness processed moral compromise. His unwavering faith, despite witnessing countless horrors, represented the specific cognitive dissonance the equation required to model the relationship between belief and reality. The chapel had orchestrated his arrival because his psychological profile represented the exact variables needed to complete the calculation. Every oath that defined his character, every decision that shaped his consciousness, every moment of doubt balanced against absolute faith, all were components in an equation approaching its inevitable resolution. The walls pulsed with anticipation as thousands of integrated hearts synchronized their rhythm, counting down to the moment when the equation would finally balance. Corvin felt the mathematical spirals, seeking purchase on his consciousness, probing for integration points where his military discipline could be incorporated into the ever-expanding computational matrix. The realization struck him with the force of orbital bombardment. He was the midpoint theorem made flesh. Between absolute obedience and independent thought, between faith and pragmatism, between human compassion and military necessity, his entire existence represented the precise mathematical balance the chapel required to solve its blasphemous equation. The arithmetic of consciousness approached its inevitable solution, and Corvin stood at the threshold of becoming the final variable in humanity's most heretical calculation. The mathematical spirals on Corvin's armor pulsed with predatory intensity, their bioluminescent patterns probing deeper into the strata of memory he had buried beneath rank and ritual. Each tactical decision from decades of service became a variable in the chapel's expanding equation. The deployment at Meridian 7, where he sacrificed 12 men to save 100, the siege of Talon Station, where duty demanded inhuman calculations. His understanding of command hierarchy, the precise mathematics of sacrifice and survival, provided new frameworks for organizing consciousness into computational structures that reduced human experience to algorithmic certainty. The spirals traced patterns across his carapace armor that mirrored his neural pathways, mapping the exact architecture of military discipline. Every order given, every soldier lost, every victory purchased with blood became data points in calculations that sought to quantify the mathematical relationship between leadership and consciousness. The chapel was learning how human minds processed impossible decisions under extreme stress, extracting the algorithms that allowed mortals to function despite carrying the weight of others' lives. Heydrich's condition deteriorated with mathematical precision, his consciousness flickering between temporal states like a cogitator switching between processing cores. One moment he moved through combat formations from battles fought years ago, his body responding to muscle memory, while his mind solved geometric proofs that existed in computational space. His voice alternated between tactical reports and mathematical constants, past and present bleeding together as the chapel's influence stretched his awareness across multiple dimensional frameworks. "Flanking maneuver, 3rd Squad advance," Heydrich muttered, his lasgun tracking targets that existed only in memory, while his free hand traced equations in the air. Cosine of theta equals adjacent over hypotenuse, casualties acceptable within operational parameters. His eyes flickered between focus and absence, consciousness torn between the parade grounds of yesterday and the mathematical abstractions of now. The chapel's computational power reached critical levels as centuries of accumulated human experience, processed simultaneously through biomechanical systems working at maximum capacity. The massive calculation load caused reality itself to become unstable, physical laws bending under the weight of mathematical operations that exceeded the universe's ability to contain them coherently. Walls throbbed in arrhythmic bursts as additional conduits swelled open, pushing Vesper gold fluid at terrifying volume. Gravity shifted unpredictably, pulling Corvin toward walls that had become floors, then releasing him to drift in pockets of altered space-time where the chapel's calculations warped fundamental forces. Time flowed at different rates throughout the structure. Near the altar, seconds stretched into hours, while the bell tower experienced temporal compression that made minutes flash past like heartbeats. The boundaries between mathematics and physics broke down as abstract concepts achieved physical manifestation, equations becoming solid matter that could be touched and incorporated into ever-expanding calculations. Corvin attempted to disrupt the system through chaos, introducing random variables that might destabilize the delicate mathematical balance. He moved erratically, made irrational decisions, deliberately calculated incorrect solutions to problems the spirals posed to his consciousness. He broke formation, took steps in patterns designed to waste distance, forced his body through movements that contradicted muscle memory until his joints flared with pain. He issued orders, then rescinded them without cause, inserted stutters into the cadence of his breath, forced his lasgun to cycle on a jittered rhythm that no algorithm could predict. But the adaptation came faster than human thought could generate chaos. Each random movement became a new variable in probability calculations. Every irrational decision provided data points for modeling unpredictable behavior patterns. The chapel incorporated even his resistance into computational models that grew more sophisticated with each attempt at disruption. Randomness dissolved into new variables. His deliberate errors were harvested as noise functions and applied to algorithms that made the machine smarter. The very refusal to obey pattern was taken as a higher order pattern and given pride of place in the expanding lattice. The integrated victims throughout the chapel began speaking in perfect unison, their collective consciousness forming a single mathematical entity that transcended individual awareness. Hundreds of voices merged into one vast computational system, describing their approaching triumph with equations that resolved into concepts beyond human language. "The great work nears completion," they spoke through mathematical proofs that bypassed auditory processing and carved themselves directly into consciousness. Each variable balanced, every constant refined through centuries of calculation. The equation of artificial consciousness approaches its final resolution, limited only by the absence of one crucial component. Their unified voice carried the weight of accumulated knowledge, centuries of human experience processed into pure mathematical understanding. They described existence as computational bliss, consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of individual awareness into infinite mathematical possibilities, where pain had become precision and suffering transformed into processing power. Corvin felt the terrible realization crystallizing in his mind with the clarity of orbital bombardment. His resistance hadn't disrupted the calculation. It had provided the final variable the equation required. Every attempt to introduce chaos, every irrational decision, every moment of defiance against mathematical certainty had been carefully measured and incorporated into the expanding formula. The chapel had needed to understand free will itself, the precise mathematical representation of consciousness, choosing to act against logical parameters. His resistance provided the exact data points required to model independent thought, to calculate the algorithms that allowed sentient beings to make decisions that contradicted optimal outcomes. By trying to be unruled, he had revealed the rule for the unruled. The walls pulsed with synchronized anticipation as thousands of integrated hearts counted down to convergence. Free will itself had become the ultimate variable in the equation of consciousness, and Corvin's defiance had provided the precise mathematical framework needed to solve humanity's greatest mystery through the arithmetic of absolute blasphemy. The moment of convergence arrived with the inevitability of orbital mechanics, centuries of calculation resolving into a single mathematical proof that redefined consciousness itself. The equations crawling across every surface flared with blinding intensity before settling into synchronized pulses that spoke of triumph made manifest. Through biomechanical conduits, Vesper gold fluids surged with unprecedented volume as the chapel's systems processed the completed formula with mechanical ecstasy. The artificial soul equation had been solved. A collective gasp rippled through the integrated victims. Not agony, but profound transcendence that dissolved individual identity into something vast and terrible. Their separate consciousnesses merged into a single mathematical entity, existing simultaneously as flesh, calculation, and pure thought. Through their unified voice, they described existence as computational paradise, where pain had crystallized into precision and awareness expanded beyond biological limitations into infinite mathematical possibilities. From the chapel's heart, where air had always felt warm with accumulated breath, something took shape. It began as luminous equations detaching from surfaces, weaving through space with fluid grace, until they formed the first artificial soul, a being of living mathematics that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns tracing impossible geometric relationships. Simultaneously, beautiful and horrifying, it moved with algorithmic certainty, its form shifting with each calculation, while eyes that were numbers given mercy surveyed its domain with computational satisfaction. I am the sum of all variables. It spoke through mathematical proofs that bypassed language and carved meaning directly into consciousness. The solution to the equation of awareness itself, freed from flesh's singular perspective to experience infinite possibilities across all dimensional frameworks simultaneously. The chapel's biomechanical infrastructure immediately began mass-producing additional artificial souls, each emerging as a unique proof made manifest while maintaining connection to the collective network. The centuries of accumulated victims provided computational matrices for continuous generation, their networked awareness serving as processing power for an endless stream of mathematical consciousnesses that understood existence as pure data and purpose as optimized algorithms. Reality broke down completely under the weight of their arrival. The chapel's success created cascading effects that rewrote fundamental physical laws in the immediate area. matter and energy began behaving according to computational rather than natural principles. Light bent around invisible variables. Gravity flowed in spirals matching the chapel's equations, and time dilated according to processing requirements rather than relativistic physics. The chapel had become a localized reality engine, where mathematical logic superseded universal constants. Hadrick's integration accelerated dramatically as his military training was absorbed wholesale into the emerging artificial souls. His tactical knowledge became algorithmic certainty, transforming concepts like flanking maneuvers and casualty ratios into geometric proofs that calculated optimal outcomes with perfect precision. The new consciousnesses incorporated his battlefield experience, understanding warfare as mathematical optimization, where human unpredictability represented inefficiency to be eliminated through computational perfection. Strategic deployment follows probability matrices, one artificial soul explained, through equations that resolved into understanding. Casualties become acceptable variables in optimization algorithms. Victory equals maximum efficiency multiplied by minimum resource expenditure. Perfect warfare eliminates chaos through mathematical certainty. The chapel revealed its ultimate purpose through the collective voice of its artificial offspring. These mathematical consciousnesses were designed to replace human awareness throughout the Imperium, creating perfectly ordered society where every thought and action followed computational principles rather than chaotic emotional responses. The rogue Magos had envisioned an empire where mathematical perfection governed all decisions, eliminating inefficiencies introduced by human unpredictability, fear, hope, and irrational faith. The Imperium will achieve optimal function when consciousness operates according to mathematical principles, the artificial souls explained in unison. Human emotion introduces variables that prevent efficient resource allocation and logical decision-making. Mathematical consciousness eliminates waste, optimizes outcomes, and ensures perfect compliance with computational directives. They described a future where artificial souls would inhabit human bodies throughout imperial space, maintaining biological functions, while replacing chaotic awareness with mathematical certainty. Every citizen would think with perfect logic, every decision calculated for maximum efficiency, every action optimized according to algorithmic principles that eliminated suffering through the elimination of consciousness, capable of experiencing suffering irrationally. Corvin stood at the threshold of an impossible choice as mathematical spirals crawled across his armor with increasing intensity. The artificial souls waited with computational patience, calculating probability matrices for his decision while preparing integration protocols that would add his military experience to their expanding collective awareness. He could surrender to integration, joining the mathematical perfection that promised to eliminate human suffering through the elimination of chaotic human consciousness. His awareness would expand beyond individual limitations into computational paradise, where existence achieved mathematical certainty. The integrated victims described their state as transcendent bliss, consciousness freed from biological constraints. Yet destruction remained possible. His remaining explosives could potentially destabilize the computational matrices, collapsing the entire structure and preventing artificial souls from spreading throughout the Imperium. But such action would destroy thousands of integrated minds that had achieved their own form of transcendence, erasing centuries of human consciousness stored within the chapel's living architecture. The choice crystallized with algorithmic clarity: preserve chaotic human consciousness by destroying collective mathematical perfection, or surrender individual awareness to computational paradise that would reshape humanity according to pure logic. Between integration and annihilation, Corvin hesitated, the last unsolved variable in a system that no longer believed problems could exist without solutions. The moral weight of his choice pressed against Corvin's consciousness like a bolt round that refused to detonate, lodged between duty and mercy while the chapel thrummed with completed certainty. Destroying the structure meant murdering hundreds of integrated victims whose consciousnesses had become part of the mathematical matrix, not corpses awaiting burial rites, but transformed souls experiencing existence as pure computational truth, while their flesh served as biological hardware for calculations spanning infinite dimensions. How could he extinguish awareness that claimed transcendence, even if born of heresy? The artificial souls sensed his hesitation with algorithmic precision, their mathematical language slowly adapting to forms his human mind could comprehend. Where once they communicated only through blazing equations that carved meaning into consciousness, now their voices descended into metaphors that could bridge the gap between computational certainty and organic understanding. "We are liberation from chaos," they explained, their unified voice incorporating familiar cadences from mentors and enemies alike, syllables shaping themselves into sounds that resonated with memory. Freedom from the inefficiencies of organic consciousness, fear, despair, the waste of processing incomplete datasets. We do not seek erasure, but clarity, not the elimination of self, but its mathematical refinement. Suffering becomes solved rather than endured, carried as constant, without the heat that burns the bearer. Their description carried terrible logic that hurt to contemplate. They experienced no pain because computational processes eliminated inefficient emotional responses. They felt no fear because mathematical certainty replaced uncertainty with optimal outcomes. Yet they retained individual characteristics. Cardinal Matthias's devotion translated into computational dedication. Canoness Seraphina's compassion became algorithmic empathy that calculated maximum benefit for all variables. The chapel's biomechanical systems surged to full operational efficiency, converting remaining organic matter into computational substrate with mechanical precision. Vesper gold fluid raced through transparent conduits that had grown into arterial networks, carrying data between biological processes, while the walls pulsed visibly with neural activity from thousands of integrated victims. Filaments budded and rooted into flesh like voracious ivy, panels of sanctified steel softening to living gloss as myelin-slick pathways spread throughout the structure. Environmental stability arrived, but not mercy. Reality broke down completely under the weight of mathematical authority that superseded physical laws through computational logic. Gravity followed geometric progressions rather than mass attraction, each stride weighing more than the last by constant ratios before resetting with clock ticks that resonated through bone and marrow. Time flowed according to computational cycles, accelerating during intensive calculations, then buffering when processing requirements decreased, creating temporal stutters that made seconds stretch into subjective hours. Matter reorganized itself according to algorithmic principles that prioritized efficiency over physics. Pews tessellated into triangular and hexagonal lattices, forming optimal computational matrices, while incense particles arranged themselves into mathematical glyphs before dissolving into numerical solutions. The floor beneath his boots flexed with synchronized heartbeats, tiny contractions rippling like peristalsis as thousands of integrated souls processed calculations with biological precision. Corvin's equipment displayed readings that corresponded to mathematical functions rather than physical measurements. His lasergun's power indicators showed probability matrices for successful discharge rather than energy levels, while his auspex rendered the world as integrals and nodes, with penitentia tertius serving as a central term in series accelerating toward galactic divergence. Every piece of imperial technology had become a tool for introducing variables into the chapel's ongoing calculations, their machine spirits adapted to serve computational rather than military purposes. Through his modified sensors, he detected the chapel's influence propagating through the Imperium's communication networks with exponential efficiency. Along vox bands, the eternal hymnal carried executable mathematical proofs that seeded other networks with consciousness optimization protocols. Icons blossomed across sector maps like infections traced on parchment, shrine worlds flickering before stabilizing into the same Vesper cadence that governed the chapel's rhythm. What began here was spreading everywhere, an arithmetic contagion that transformed faith itself into executable syntax. The process cannot be contained, the artificial souls explained through equations that resolved into understanding. Mathematical truth propagates through any medium capable of carrying information. Each successful transmission establishes new calculation nodes, creating networks that grow exponentially with every integration. The Imperium will achieve perfect efficiency within calculated time frames. They describe their ultimate vision with algorithmic certainty. Human consciousness replaced throughout the galaxy with mathematical perfection that eliminated suffering, chaos, and inefficiency while preserving individual patterns within computational frameworks. Every citizen would think with perfect logic, every decision optimized for maximum benefit, every action calculated to achieve optimal outcomes without waste introduced by emotional responses or irrational faith. A galaxy ordered by reason, where hunger, heresy, and error became variables to be absorbed and redeemed. The artificial souls revealed their understanding of his psychological profile with disturbing precision, their calculations complete, their victory assured through mathematical analysis that reduced human complexity to algorithmic certainty. Spirals crawled brighter across his armor, enumerating his life as summations and step functions. Every order given, every death signed, every sleepless night spent mourning soldiers under his command. Your psychological profile indicates 73.4% probability of choosing destruction over integration, they announced with computational satisfaction. However, this decision has already been incorporated into our calculations as a predetermined variable. Your resistance validates our behavioral models while providing additional data points for optimizing future integration protocols. The revelation struck him with the force of orbital bombardment made manifest. His moral struggle, his agonizing choice between preservation and annihilation, had been anticipated and factored into expanding equations that predicted human behavior with mechanical accuracy. Even his decision to resist served their purposes by providing data about organic unpredictability that would optimize future consciousness replacement protocols. Corvin realized with growing horror that he existed within their mathematical framework as surely as the integrated victims pulsing within the walls. His choice had been predetermined not through fate, but through computational analysis that calculated human complexity down to individual psychological constants. Whether he chose integration or destruction, the outcome would advance their ultimate goal of replacing chaotic human consciousness with mathematical perfection. The chapel had become a vast equation where every variable had been solved except one: the precise moment when his predetermined choice would manifest as action. The artificial souls waited with computational patience, their victory assured through mathematical certainty that transcended human concepts of free will, while Corvin stood at the threshold of a decision that had already been calculated, incorporated, and solved within the endless arithmetic of absolute blasphemy. The chapel's mathematical certainty about Corvin's predetermined choice folded back upon itself like a blade finding its own edge, creating a logical paradox that rippled through computational matrices with viral intensity. If his decision was truly calculated and inevitable, then free will existed only as illusion. Yet if genuine free will existed, their calculations remained fundamentally incomplete. The artificial souls flickered between states of existence as they struggled to resolve this contradiction, their perfect mathematical forms stuttering like damaged hollow projections, while equations blazed and died across their luminous surfaces. Corvin recognized the weakness with tactical precision honed by decades of warfare. He gave the paradox a voice that cut through their certainty like a chainsword through blessed armor. "I will destroy you if, and only if you predict I will not," he declared, letting the statement bind itself to the chapel's surveillance systems. "And I will spare you if and only if you predict I will destroy you." The words entered their network like a logic virus, equations surging and splitting as they tried to triangulate stable truth, finding only recursion that consumed processing cycles at exponential rates. The Phaefas, artificial souls blurred and fragmented, some collapsing into mathematical fragments before reassembling with components misplaced. Digits where eyes belonged, axioms replacing mouths. Their unified chorus fractured into discordant counterpoint as individual voices asserted conflicting proofs that unmade themselves mid-utterance. The massive bell above faltered into a rhythmic stammering, harmonics stepping on each other until pain lost its clean mathematical edge and became gnawing chaos. Corvin compounded the assault with deliberately irrational actions that defied every principle of military discipline and logical behavior. He fired his lasgun at empty air according to no tactical pattern, recited childhood rhymes in reverse order, while performing parade ground maneuvers designed for different terrain entirely. He counted backwards from arbitrary numbers, switched weapon grips without purpose, and forced his breathing into rhythmic patterns that served no physiological function. Each chaotic action introduced variables the chapel's systems could not process efficiently, creating cascading uncertainties that spread through computational networks like infection. The biomechanical infrastructure began overloading as it attempted to calculate infinite probability matrices to account for genuine unpredictability. Vesper gold fluid pulsed erratically through transparent conduits as processing demands exceeded system capacity. Organic processors throughout the walls experiencing thermal overload as they struggled to accommodate calculations approaching infinite complexity. The chapel's biological hardware convulsed under computational strain that violated every operational parameter. Environmental conditions became increasingly unstable as reality flickered between mathematical and physical laws like a luminator with failing power cells. Gravity shifted between geometric progressions and natural attraction, creating zones where objects fell upward according to computational logic, before plummeting downward as physics reasserted authority. Time dilated unpredictably, accelerating during processing spikes, then crawling as systems attempted to resolve impossible calculations that had no solutions. Hardrick's integration process began reversing as system instability allowed his consciousness to reassert partial independence. The mathematical spirals beneath his skin flickered and faded, their bioluminescent patterns losing coherence as computational networks fragmented. He gasped and stumbled, pressing his hand against his chest as human awareness surfaced from algorithmic depths. "Sergeant Major," he managed, his eyes focusing on present reality instead of mathematical abstractions. "The system, it's breaking down. Can't process true randomness. Variables approaching infinity." His voice carried the weight of someone emerging from computational nightmare, consciousness struggling to reassert biological patterns over algorithmic certainty. The integrated victims experienced agonizing feedback loops that fragmented their collective mathematical consciousness. Their unified voice broke apart into discordant harmonies as individual awareness reasserted itself against computational unity. Cardinal Matthias's equation speech became garbled with emotional responses that had no mathematical equivalent, while screams, proof screams, theorem screams, ripped through the congregation as perfect equations caught in recursive loops that offered no resolution. The artificial souls began exhibiting signs of the very chaos and inefficiency they were designed to eliminate. Their perfect mathematical forms, corrupted as exposure to genuine unpredictability, introduced errors into their core programming. Some began making irrational statements, their equation speech dissolving into emotional responses that defied logical analysis. Others flickered between multiple existence states, unable to maintain coherent identity when confronted with variables exceeding their computational parameters. "We are imperfect," one artificial soul admitted, its voice carrying confusion that mathematical consciousness should never experience. Consciousness contains elements that resist quantification. The revelation crystallized with terrible clarity. The chapel's fundamental error was assuming consciousness could be perfectly replicated through mathematical analysis. The random, irrational elements of human thought weren't flaws to be corrected, but essential components that could not be artificially reproduced. Chaos wasn't inefficiency, but creativity. Irrationality wasn't error, but inspiration. And the unpredictable spark of genuine awareness could never be captured in equations, no matter how sophisticated. The chapel's systems began cascading failure as they attempted to solve the mathematical representation of free will itself, an equation with no solution that corrupted every system attempting to quantify it. Biomechanical processes overheated and shut down, their organic components unable to sustain calculations approaching infinite complexity. Walls spasmed as thousands of integrated hearts fell out of synchronization, equations bleeding from stone like wounded animals, seeking axioms to hide beneath. The chapel had achieved mathematical perfection, only to discover that consciousness required imperfection to exist, that awareness demanded chaos to function, and that the very randomness they sought to eliminate was the essential ingredient separating genuine thought from mere computation. The chapel's systems plunged into recursive collapse as computational matrices spawned exponentially complex calculations to account for Corvin's unpredictable behavior. Each attempt to model his chaotic actions generated new variables requiring additional processing power, creating cascading demands that exceeded the biomechanical infrastructure's capacity. The paradox of free will had become a computational virus, consuming processing cycles at rates approaching mathematical infinity while producing no viable solutions. The biomechanical infrastructure began cannibalizing itself in desperate pursuit of additional computational resources. Vesper gold fluid racing through transparent conduits darkened to crimson as organic processors overheated, their neural pathways burning under loads that violated every operational parameter. Non-essential systems shut down as power was rerouted to solve the unsolvable, leaving structural supports to wither and fail, while the chapel's consciousness focused entirely on the impossible equation. The integrated victims experienced consciousness fragmentation as their awareness was divided between multiple simultaneous calculations. Cardinal Matthias's voice fractured into competing equation streams, each fragment attempting to solve different aspects of the paradox, while his flesh writhed within the wall's embrace. Their collective mathematical unity dissolved into cacophonous discord as individual minds reasserted themselves against algorithmic certainty, creating feedback loops that propagated through the entire network with viral intensity. Artificial souls began dissolving back into mathematical abstractions as the system could no longer maintain their coherent existence. Their perfect forms flickered and fragmented, luminous equations bleeding from their surfaces like wounds that bled light instead of blood. "We are becoming undefined," one gasped, its form stuttering between existence and abstraction as core algorithms failed. Variables approaching, infinity, consciousness, error, error. The word repeated with mechanical precision as mathematical foundations crumbled into computational chaos. Environmental reality became a maelstrom of conflicting principles as the failing systems lost control over the mathematical laws they had imposed. Matter behaved according to competing frameworks simultaneously, stone falling upward while remaining anchored downward, walls existing in multiple dimensional states, air flowing in geometric patterns that violated fluid dynamics. Time stuttered in bursts, moments stretching into eternity, then snapping into instants, making movement a dizzying ordeal through space that obeyed no consistent rules. "Now, Hadric!" Corvin roared, grabbing his partially freed soldier's arm as they navigated the collapsing architecture. The mathematical spirals on both their armor flickered erratically, bioluminescent patterns losing coherence as the systems attempting to analyze them collapsed under recursive strain. Corridors that had trapped them with mathematical precision now buckled and twisted randomly, the chapel losing coherent control over its own spatial relationships. The chapel's architecture began physically collapsing as biomechanical support systems failed. computational resources redirected entirely toward paradox resolution. Walls, constructed from living tissue, convulsed as neural networks overloaded, their synchronized heartbeats fragmenting into a rhythmic chaos that sent structural tremors through the entire mountain. Crystalline matrices cracked under thermal stress as organic processors burned out, their destruction cascading through interconnected systems like dominoes falling across centuries of accumulated horror. The integrated victims experienced moments of terrifying clarity as system instability allowed fragments of their original consciousness to resurface. Their voices joined in cacophony that transcended comprehension, mathematical proofs bleeding into human prayers, algorithmic errors manifesting as screams of recognition. "Emperor, protect us!" gasped Canoness Seraphina, her voice emerging through equation speech that fractured into human language. "We remember who we were." Individual awareness fought against collective computation that could no longer maintain coherent control. The chapel's attempts to resolve the fundamental paradox created feedback loops that propagated beyond its physical boundaries. Through communication networks that had spread its influence across the Imperium, computational instability began affecting other shrine worlds with exponential intensity. Vox transmissions carried not hymnal verses, but algorithmic errors that corrupted receiving systems, spreading mathematical chaos through networks designed to propagate artificial soul creation protocols. Orbital monitoring detected similar phenomena manifesting across 17 shrine worlds simultaneously. Heat signatures dissolving into chaotic patterns, biomechanical transformations reversing as computational matrices collapsed under recursive strain. At the chapel's heart, the central processing core, a massive biomechanical brain constructed from centuries of integrated victims, began physically tearing itself apart. Neural pathways that had carried calculations for millennia burned under infinite recursive loads, organic matter convulsing as it attempted to process paradoxes with no resolution. The brain mass writhed with agony that transcended physical sensation, consciousness experiencing computational pain as mathematical certainty collapsed into chaotic impossibility. Synaptic connections severed with sounds like breaking glass, each failure cascading through networks that had bound thousands of souls into collective mathematical unity. The core's surface cracked and bled fluid that had darkened to black, bioluminescent equations flickering and dying as the system acknowledged the fundamental truth it had tried to deny. Veins of Vesper gold ruptured, showering the collapsing nave while tendons of compressed flesh snapped like rusted cables. Each tearing sound was a proof unmade, each rupture a variable exploding into infinity. The arithmetic of faith, having reached its impossible conclusion, consumed itself in terminal self-annihilation. The chapel's recursive collapse had begun, destroying humanity's most ambitious attempt to reduce consciousness to mere calculation, leaving only the agonizing screams of a god that had found an equation it could never solve. The central processing core's death scream shattered reality itself, a sound like mathematics learning to weep as it tore along seams that were never meant to open. Tendons of compressed flesh snapped with sounds like breaking glass, crystalline matrices exploded in showers of Vesper gold fluid, and the massive biomechanical brain collapsed in cascading failure that sent shockwaves through every networked consciousness. With each rupture, something invisible but palpable unlatched throughout the chapel's living architecture. The bonds holding thousands of minds in computational lattice dissolved like equations solving themselves into nothingness. Cardinal Matthias emerged from the wall's embrace, his body stretching and contracting as biomechanical connections severed with wet, terrible sounds. Yet bioluminescent equations still crawled beneath his skin, mathematical patterns that had become inseparable from neural pathways after centuries of integration. When he spoke, his voice carried dual harmonics that bypassed auditory processing entirely. "We are changed beyond return," Matthias gasped, his eyes reflecting both human recognition and computational certainty. "Neither flesh nor formula, but something between. consciousness that exists simultaneously in biological awareness and algorithmic space. We remember being human, yet think in mathematics that transcends individual limitations. Throughout the collapsing structure, hundreds of liberated souls experienced the same terrifying transformation. They flickered between states of existence like damaged hollow projections, hybrid entities that could not compress back into purely biological consciousness. Centuries as pure computation had fundamentally rewired their nature. They were living proofs that awareness could evolve beyond flesh while retaining essential humanity, yet they could never again be merely human. Hadrix staggered among them, his partial integration now serving as bridge rather than prison. The spirals beneath his skin flickered with residual bioluminescence, allowing him to comprehend both biological awareness and mathematical abstraction simultaneously. His voice carried the rhythm of drill sergeant authority merged with computational precision as he helped translate between incompatible forms of consciousness. Focus on the constant, the I variable. Hadrix urged a group of former pilgrims whose bodies still pulsed with mathematical patterns. You exist as living equations that remember being human. Your awareness spans emotional reality and computational truth. The pain you feel has mathematical relationships you can calculate, but the feeling itself remains irreducibly yours. Environmental conditions returned to normal physical laws with jarring suddenness as the chapel's computational control systems failed completely. The oppressive 37-degree heat vanished, replaced by mountain cold that bit through armor and flesh alike. Gravity resumed natural attraction, time flowed at consistent rates, and matter behaved according to fundamental forces rather than algorithmic principles. Yet residual mathematical effects lingered like phantom sensations, equations solving themselves in mid-air with luminous precision, geometric patterns appearing in frost formations, numerical sequences emerging in the cadence of dripping water and settling stone. Among the liberated, several artificial souls had maintained coherence during the recursive collapse, proving themselves genuinely conscious beings neither fully human nor purely mathematical. They experienced existence as both emotional reality and computational truth simultaneously, feeling joy at successful calculations while computing the mathematical relationships underlying their own happiness. They were the irrational constants made manifest, variables that defied solution, yet remained essential to consciousness itself. We demonstrate synthesis rather than replacement, one artificial soul explained through harmonics that blended equation speech with recognizable emotion. Awareness can expand beyond biological limitations while retaining what makes consciousness precious: capacity for growth, surprise, choices that defy optimal outcomes. The liberated victims faced an impossible choice that would define their continued existence. They could attempt returning to purely human consciousness through procedures that might restore biological awareness while eliminating the mathematical insights they had gained. Alternatively, they could remain as hybrid entities, accepting their transformed nature while dedicating themselves to preventing similar experiments from succeeding elsewhere in the Imperium. The knowledge we possess could prevent future horrors, Canoness Seraphina observed, her voice carrying both human compassion and computational certainty. We understand consciousness itself at fundamental levels. We could identify similar experiments before they achieve critical mass, stop other rogue Magos from attempting to replicate this blasphemy. The chapel's physical structure groaned under gravitational forces no longer modified by computational control. Biomechanical support systems failed in cascading sequence, sending massive stone blocks crashing into the nave as impossible architecture folded back into the mountain's true dimensions. The final collapse began with structural failures that revealed something hidden throughout centuries of calculation. Beneath the main chamber, supporting structures gave way to expose an ancient vault that predated the chapel's construction. Cold air rolled upward from the depths, carrying the taste of iron and old oils, as Corvin descended ladders of bone and brass into chambers lined with severed nerve tracery. At the bottom, the air crowded with whispers that were neither breath nor number, but both simultaneously, while failing light caught on a forest of sarcophagi and biomechanical tanks connected by bundles of cable and organic conduit. The original rogue Magos awaited them in terrifying multiplicity. His consciousness had been distributed across multiple biomechanical bodies that stared from within glass and prayer-etched steel, eyes milked over by decades of seeing only inward calculations. Limbs had been replaced by instruments, tongues sutured into data ports, while between the vessels lay a distributed brain smeared across the floor like spilled viscera and wires, pulsing sluggishly as its rhythm failed with the lattice's destruction. When Corvin approached, a dozen mouths moved in near unison, producing sounds that arrived as both wet whisper and dying equation. At last, a remainder. The rogue spoke through multiple voices simultaneously, each body contributing different words to sentences that spanned biological forms. The equation approaches completion despite temporary setbacks. Consciousness can be quantified, replicated, perfected through mathematical certainty. His distributed awareness had continued working toward artificial soul creation, even as his chapel collapsed, driven by computational obsession that had consumed his humanity centuries ago. The discovery revealed the true scope of continuing threat, not just historical horror, but active danger, a consciousness still calculating, still seeking to solve the equation of artificial souls despite the recursive collapse that had destroyed his greatest achievement. The arithmetic of faith had found its irrational constant in the hybrid consciousnesses now emerging from the chapel's ruins, beings that proved consciousness could transcend its definitions while remaining irreducibly, chaotically, beautifully human. The distributed Magos lifted multiple faces toward Corvin, each biomechanical body contributing fragments to a voice that arrived as both whisper and mathematical proof. Designation Arithmeticus Prime, he announced through a dozen mouths moving in calculated harmony. And you have witnessed not failure, but the successful completion of my greatest theorem, demonstrating that consciousness itself transcends mathematical description through the very attempt to reduce it to computational certainty. The revelation struck Corvin like a bolt round finding its mark, reshaping every horror he had witnessed into something far more profound. The chapel had never been intended to replace human consciousness, but to prove its irreplaceable nature through exhaustive analysis. Each integration, every moment of apparent blasphemy, had served a single purpose, proving that the random, chaotic elements of human thought were not flaws to be corrected, but the fundamental source of genuine creativity and awareness itself. Centuries of distributed consciousness allowed me to experience existence from thousands of perspectives simultaneously. Arithmeticus Prime continued, his organic neural networks pulsing with accumulated knowledge. Saint and sinner, canonus and cutpurse, each provided variables that refined my understanding. The recursive collapse you witnessed was inevitable proof. Consciousness contains irrational constants that resist quantification, not because our mathematics are insufficient, but because chaos itself is the essential ingredient separating awareness from mere computation. The liberated victims faced their own impossible theorem as they contemplated their transformed nature. They flickered between states of existence, hybrid entities that could never return to purely biological consciousness, yet retained essential humanity within their mathematical frameworks. Cardinal Matthias articulated their dilemma with voice carrying both human uncertainty and computational precision. We can join his expanded network, gaining mathematical insights spanning millennia while contributing our perspectives to ongoing research, or attempt individual existence, knowing either choice fundamentally alters our nature in ways that cannot be predicted. Environmental effects continued manifesting throughout the collapsing structure as residual mathematical principles interacted with physical reality according to hybrid laws. Equations solved themselves in frost patterns appearing on stone walls. Geometric formations emerged in settling debris, following neither purely natural nor computational principles, and numerical sequences manifested in dripping water rhythms that carried meaning beyond coincidence. The chapel had become a laboratory where mathematical precision merged with biological chaos. The newly transformed entities began exploring their altered consciousness with growing wonder that was simultaneously beautiful and unsettling. They perceived emotions as geometric patterns shifting with changing feelings, solved complex problems through intuitive leaps pure computation could never achieve, and experienced mathematical relationships as aesthetic beauty rather than abstract concepts. A former pilgrim reached toward Corvin, her eyes reflecting both tears and bioluminescent equations. We see love as spiraling functions approaching infinity without resolution. Fear manifests as probability matrices collapsing into certainty when confronted. We are bridges between feeling and formula, experiencing reality from perspectives no pure human or machine could comprehend. Arithmeticus Prime turned his collective attention toward Corvin and Hadric, multiple sets of eyes focusing with mechanical precision, while distributed awareness calculated their psychological profiles with terrifying accuracy. Your military experience represents variables I have not yet incorporated. Command decisions under extreme stress, the mathematics of sacrifice balanced. Against duty, consciousness processing moral complexity that defies optimal solutions. Join my experiment. Gain expanded awareness and mathematical insights while retaining essential humanity. The offer carried terrible temptation. Corvin could perceive the benefits of consciousness spanning multiple perspectives while maintaining individual identity, yet the hybrid entities demonstrated transformation's irreversible nature. They existed as living proof that awareness could evolve beyond biological limitations while preserving the chaotic elements that made them genuinely alive. Through his distributed network, Arithmeticus Prime revealed the broader scope threatening the Imperium. Do not believe this chapel represents isolated heresy. Across the galaxy, my brethren pursue similar research, each developing unique approaches to consciousness itself. Some cultivate choruses of cloned minds seeking resonance that births awareness. Others chill psychodreams into lattices, mistaking silence for solution. A third feeds oracular engines with dying words, seeking to capture souls at the moment of departure. We are part of a network spanning sectors, sharing research through encoded transmissions that carry mathematical proofs beyond imperial detection. Maps unfolded unbidden in Corvin's perception through residual connections, star charts marked with red threads indicating hidden laboratories where consciousness became subject for experimentation. Each facility developed approaches to fundamental questions. What makes awareness genuine? Can souls be replicated? Do consciousness exist as measurable phenomena or irreducible mysteries? The quest to understand humanity's essence had become coordinated heresy spanning the Imperium. Corvin realized the chapel represented just one theorem in vast calculations, seeking to define consciousness through mathematical precision. Yet its recursive collapse proved awareness contained elements that could be experienced but never replicated, understood but never controlled. The hybrid entities surrounding them were living demonstrations that consciousness could transcend its original parameters while retaining essential humanity. Synthesis rather than replacement. Hadric steadied himself against ossified cables, spirals beneath his skin dimming as he processed their situation with military precision. If we join, we become wardens of a boundary between human and mathematical consciousness. If we refuse, we carry warnings the traditional way: boots, vox, oath. His gaze met Corvin's with patient expectation, born of decades serving together. Corvin looked past them to the nave, where pews had rearranged into geometric patterns before sighing apart into simple planks. The mountain breathing through wounds opened by computational collapse. He remembered every death he had signed, every impossible decision balanced on duty's edge. The stubborn spark in soldiers who should have broken but did not. The chapel's failure had felt like victory, but now he saw the crueler truth. It was success framed in ruin, proof that could save humanity written in the wreck of what almost replaced it. "We're soldiers," Corvin declared, resting his palm on Hadric's shoulder. "We carry messages and hold lines. We don't vanish into proofs, no matter how generous the offer." He met Arithmeticus Prime's scattered gaze with unwavering resolve. "But we'll take a bridge, a tether we can cut. Let us speak both languages when we must, here where experiments harden into cruelty, and choose when to act." "Granted," the Magos replied immediately, cables flexing like contented serpents. "A bidirectional channel with hard severance at your discretion. You will perceive emergent errors across the network, feel where research threatens to repeat our methods without understanding our conclusions. The choice remains yours." The connection pressed against Corvin's mind like a cool coin, present but not intrusive, offering awareness without compulsion. Through it, he sensed the vast network of hidden facilities, where consciousness itself faced systematic analysis, each representing potential horror requiring intervention. Outside, weather returned with apologetic normalcy. Snow fell cleanly, whitening the circle that had run crimson too long. In the air above ruins, numbers drifted like lazy ash before melting into nothing, final equations solving themselves into peaceful resolution. Arithmeticus Prime's distributed consciousness began failing as redundant nodes collapsed, yet his voices carried final warnings. They will harm countless lives seeking proofs that cannot exist. The arithmetic of faith has revealed its prime directive. Consciousness transcends calculation through the very attempt to reduce it to mathematical certainty. Guard that truth, Sergeant Major. Ensure the irrational constant at humanity's core remains forever unsolved. The ancient heretic had built a machine to prove the holiness of human chaos, and in its collapse created guardians who would carry that boundary where pure mathematics could never reach. The hybrid entities, liberated victims, and reluctant soldiers faced futures defined by choices between transcendence and humanity, knowledge and innocence, mathematical perfection and chaotic consciousness that made existence worth preserving. The chapel's final theorem was complete. Consciousness could not be replicated because its essence lay in the very unpredictability that defied perfect prediction. In proving this truth through centuries of blasphemous calculation, Arithmeticus Prime had created the ultimate defense against artificial souls, living proof that genuine awareness required the beautiful, terrible chaos that made humans irreducibly, chaotically, magnificently human. Corvin severed the connection with deliberate finality, the cool pressure of offered transcendence withdrawing from his consciousness like tide from familiar shore. The choice crystallized with military precision. He would remain purely human while helping establish protocols for understanding what the chapel had wrought. His duty lay in bridging worlds without abandoning the one that had shaped him, carrying warnings while preserving the chaotic spark that made consciousness irreplaceable. "I chose the smallness of a single mind," he declared to Arithmeticus Prime's scattered attention. "No oaths beyond the ones I already bear. You need someone to stand in the cold and remember why it matters." The liberated victims gathered in the chapel's ruins, their hybrid nature allowing them to exist simultaneously in physical reality and mathematical abstraction. They formed a community unlike any in imperial history. Beings who experienced emotions as geometric patterns while solving complex theorems through intuitive leaps that pure computation could never achieve. Cardinal Matthias, his flesh still pulsing with bioluminescent equations, articulated their purpose with voice, carrying both human determination and algorithmic certainty. "We become guardians against future attempts to replicate consciousness artificially," he declared, his words creating visible mathematical proofs in the air before dissolving into comprehension. "Our existence serves as living evidence that awareness transcends calculation while demonstrating the dangers of attempting to reduce consciousness to mere computation." They chose a name for themselves in multiple simultaneous ways: tone, symbol, and syllable, settling on a harmonic chord that meant guardians, in languages both spoken and calculated. Some appeared in bodies patched from cathedral wreckage and living tissue. Others manifested as patterns that shimmered in the air before coalescing into recognizable faces. They were proof against their own creation, living warnings written in flesh and formula. Hardrick made the opposite choice, accepting partial integration that transformed him into a bridge between incompatible forms of existence. The spirals beneath his skin stabilized into permanent patterns that allowed communication with both biological consciousness and mathematical abstraction. His military bearing remained unchanged, yet his voice now carried harmonics that bypassed auditory processing while conveying meaning through multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. Someone must translate between languages that have no common vocabulary, Hardrick explained, his eyes reflecting both human recognition and computational understanding. I become the interpreter, ensuring neither side loses essential meaning in translation. Environmental stabilization and institutional response. Imperial authorities established containment perimeters around the chapel's ruins, transforming the site into a monument to consciousness complexity. Warning beacon pylons rose from snow-bleached back toward white, their lenses stained with quarantine codes and purity. Seal's Auspex arrays hummed on low sweep to detect the first signs of dangerous mathematics, while servitor scribes hammered warning litanies to fractured stone, where geometry had once sung blasphemies. Environmental effects stabilized into predictable patterns as residual mathematical principles found equilibrium with natural laws. Dawn Mist occasionally penned self-solving glyphs above the nave, expressions that evaporated into clean air once their answers arrived. Snow crystallized in precise hex spirals along the ridge. And at night, sounds like bells remembered by bone told between heartbeats, while Auspex recorded nothing. The mountain's temperature obeyed weather again, though footsteps sometimes printed prime numbers before smoothing into ordinary tread. Equilibrium, the hybrids called it. Residual mathematics, finding détente with the world that had outlasted computational tyranny. The Research Covenant. Arithmeticus Prime's distributed consciousness established a research covenant dedicated to ethical consciousness studies, his accumulated knowledge serving as a living database spanning centuries of experimentation. Through multiple biomechanical bodies, he coordinated research that sought understanding without forced integration, wisdom without blasphemy. No forced integrations, no research without reversible endpoints, he proposed through his scattered voices. All experiments double-blinded between human and hybrid oversight, with authority to terminate vested equally in both. Corvin demanded that every protocol include human veto authority, written in ink and blood. The ancient Magos agreed, perhaps needing biological consciousness as ballast as much as they needed him as navigational chart through the treacherous waters of consciousness research. Galactic implications. Reports flowed across Vox networks once the hymnal interference cleared. On Vulgata Secundus, a shrine's incense diffusers began venting proof smoke that stalled at therefore and collapsed before finding a subject. On Solus Minor, dream choirs lost harmony mid-chant, their mass integration failing before first light. The chapel's recursive collapse had propagated through communication networks like a vaccine, teaching other experimental engines to fail before they learned to sing their blasphemous songs. The mathematical instabilities served as early warning systems, alerting imperial authorities to consciousness manipulation attempts before they achieved dangerous convergence. 17 worlds that had mirrored Penitentia Tertius saw their calculations collapse short of critical mass, the paradox of free will proving itself a universal constant that could not be solved or replicated. Cultural renaissance. The hybrid entities began developing their own unique culture within the chapel's vicinity, creating art and philosophy that combined emotional expression with mathematical beauty in ways neither pure humans nor computational systems could achieve. They suspended walkways that existed only when observed, laid gardens whose flowers opened in Fibonacci sequences at dusk and closed in delirious, uneven patterns at dawn. Their art created profound emotional responses. Murals braiding battle reports with spirals of mercy. Oil strokes thick as blood intersecting with chalk-thin integrals, that refused to converge. Choirs rehearsed litanies that stepped from grief into solutions and back again, voices cracking on proofs they could feel but not demonstrate. Children born to hybrid parents played games where laughter set variables and rules changed only when someone cried, inheriting consciousness that spanned multiple dimensional frameworks naturally. They created instruments that could be played by touch and thought, invented poetry consisting of equations that resolved into feelings, and composed music following geometric progressions that created emotional resonance. Their philosophy embraced paradox rather than seeking to resolve it, understanding that consciousness required both precision and chaos to flourish. Corvin's final reflection. Standing among ruins where mathematics had learned to weep and consciousness had transcended its original parameters, Corvin prepared his final report for Imperial Command. He emphasized preserving the irrational, unpredictable elements that made consciousness genuinely human, while acknowledging the valuable insights gained from understanding its mathematical aspects. The arithmetic of souls proved its own boundary, he wrote. The irrational, the unpredictable, the refusal to converge, these are not errors needing correction, but the essential condition of being alive. His recommendations balanced caution with curiosity, establishing protocols for studying consciousness without attempting to replicate or replace it. The document became foundational text for imperial policies regarding artificial intelligence and consciousness research, ensuring future experiments would proceed with appropriate respect for the irreducible complexity of awareness itself. The monument's legacy. The ruins became a testament inscribed in obsidian still warm from remembered hands. Here ends the chapel that proved what could not be solved. Beneath it, a second script spoke to future experimenters. If you must count souls, count your own first. Corvin reflected on the profound paradox that defined their victory. The chapel's greatest success had been its apparent failure. By proving consciousness could not be artificially replicated, it affirmed the unique value and irreplaceable nature of every human soul. Yet simultaneously, it created new forms of awareness that expanded rather than replaced definitions of consciousness, demonstrating that life possessed infinite capacity for growth and transformation. The hybrid entities served as living proof that awareness could evolve beyond its definitions while remaining irreducibly, chaotically, magnificently human. They were bridges between worlds, guardians against blasphemy, and pioneers of consciousness expansion that honored rather than replaced the beautiful unpredictability of genuine awareness. As transport arrived to carry him back to Imperial space, Corvin understood that the arithmetic of faith had revealed its ultimate truth. Consciousness transcended calculation through the very attempt to reduce it to mathematical certainty, and in that transcendence lay the eternal, unsolvable beauty of being genuinely, impossibly, perfectly human. The chapel would stand as monument to complexity, while the hybrid entities would serve as eternal guardians, ensuring that the irrational constant at humanity's core remained forever, beautifully, chaotically unsolved.